Hey everyone, welcome. How you doing today? Well, last week we were beginning to look at the story of Nehemiah, which is in the Old Testament. And Nehemiah is an individual there. He's one of the Jewish folks who is in exile away from Jerusalem. He himself has never been there, but he dreamed of Jerusalem. It must have been on his heart so much. But when he finds out that rather than it having been rebuilt, that it's in fact a heap of ruins, its walls are tumbled down, its gates are all burned, and more importantly for him, the people there are in a dreadful state, in disgrace, we're told. Well, he just breaks down and he weeps when he thinks of them all. Nehemiah himself is in Persia. The northern kingdom of Israel, it had been taken over by the superpower of the day, the Assyrians in the 700s BC. Then in the 500s BC, the Babylonians had rolled in, and that's when Jerusalem had really been destroyed, with many of its people being carted off in exile to Babylon. By the rivers of Babylon, we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion. But now it's about 100 years or so later than that. It's about 445 BC, thereabouts, and Nehemiah is in what is now the Persian kingdom, the latest superpower in the area. About 100 years later, in the 300s BC, well, that's when the Greeks would come in under Alexander the Great, yet another superpower to rule over that area. But for now, Nehemiah is in Persia, and he's in a city called Susa, which is the winter palace of the king there. And that place of Susa, it comes up in other places in the Old Testament. And we know that others who were in exile during this whole period of time were there and held a high office in the kingdoms of that region. So, for example, we hear of Esther. She was a female leader, and she was in Susa, we're told in Esther chapter 2. Now, there was in the citadel of Susa a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin named Mordecai, and he was a relative of Esther who was there. And Daniel, we read of Susa again. In fact, one of Daniel's great visions takes place in Susa. In chapter 8, he says, "In my vision, I saw myself in the citadel of Susa in the province of Elam." And this is where Nehemiah is as well. In fact, his book begins in the month of Kislev in the 20th year, while I was in the citadel of Susa. And if you went to Susa today, well, it's a big if, actually, you might, but it's in southwestern Iran. I'm not sure if you can get there, but you'd, for example, be able to see what is reputed to be the tomb of Daniel, which is there. It's an important place. It is now, and it was back then as well. But Nehemiah's there, and he's cupbearer to the king. And when we say cupbearer, try and put out of your mind some kind of butler image or anything like that. This is a high-ranking official. He's a confidant of the king. He's very powerful in the kingdom, is Nehemiah. And the king would have known him very well. And as soon as Nehemiah goes in one day, the king takes one look at him and says, "What's up with you?" He knows immediately that something is wrong. And Nehemiah explains the whole situation. And then we read in chapter 2, verse 8, that he makes a request to the king. Can I have a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, so that he'll give me timber to make beams for the gates of the citadel by the temple and for the upper city wall and for the residence I'll occupy. And then we're told, because the gracious hand of my God was upon me, the king granted my requests. And now Nehemiah is on his way to Jerusalem. And that's where we pick up the story.
Nehemiah chapter 2, verses 11 to 18. I went to Jerusalem, and after staying there 3 days, I set out during the night with a few men. I had not told anyone what my God had put in my heart to do for Jerusalem. There were no mounts with me except the one I was riding on. By night I went out through the valley gate towards the Jackal Well and the Dung Gate, examining the walls of Jerusalem, which had broken down, and its gates which had been destroyed by fire. Then I moved on towards the Fountain Gate and the King's Pool, but there was not enough room for my mount to get through, so I went up the valley by night, examining the wall. Finally, I turned back and re-entered through the valley gate. The officials did not know where I had gone or what I was doing, because as yet I had said nothing to the Jews or the priests or nobles or officials or any others who would be doing the work. Then I said to them, "You see the trouble we are in? Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates are burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace." I also told them about the gracious hand of my God upon me, and what the king had said to me. They replied, "Let us start rebuilding." So they began this good work.
So Nehemiah arrives in Jerusalem. What's the first thing he begins to do? Well, you could think, well, he's recruiting other folks here, but that's not the first thing that he does. Or maybe he goes and surveys the walls by night and looks over everything that's to be done. Well, he does do that, but actually that's not the first thing he does either. The first thing he does is that he rests. And we're told that he went to Jerusalem and he stayed there for 3 days before he did anything else. He needed to rest. It reminds us of Ezra. And Ezra and Nehemiah, in many ways, really should be read together for this whole period of the rebuilding of Jerusalem. And we're told in Ezra chapter 8 and verses 31 to 32 that on the 12th day of the first month we set out from the Ahava Canal to go to Jerusalem. The hand of our God was on us, and he protected us from our enemies and bandits along the way. So we arrived in Jerusalem, where we rested for 3 days. He rested for 3 days. Nehemiah also rests when he gets there. And it's no surprise he's been on an arduous and a long journey. It's about 1,000 miles, give or take, over desert and mountains, unfamiliar terrain. For him, it would have been a long, hard journey, not just days, but weeks and possibly months. And he would have gone from the comfort of the citadel of Susa to a place that is just a heap of ruins. He's gone from being cupbearer to the king to this new role in an unfamiliar place. So many changes for him in so many ways, not just geographically, but so many other ways as well. And it's about a journey going from the familiar to the unfamiliar, from the known to the unknown, from the secure to the insecure. And a lot of us have been on a journey like that recently, if we think about it. And it's tiring, and it's exhausting, whether we realize it or not, and it's stressful too, even if we're just registering that stress in the background. Nehemiah needed to rest, and it wasn't just about doing nothing. It would have been about recentering himself, settling down to this new situation, getting re-energized, revitalized for the next stage of the journey. Everybody needs rest. It reminds me a little bit in 1 Kings 18 of Elijah, and he'd been in a great confrontation, and then he flees off to Horeb. And then we're told at one point, he says, "I've had enough, Lord." And then he lay down under a tree and he fell asleep. But an angel came and touched him and said, "Get up and eat." And he looked around. There by his head was a cake of bread baked over hot coals and a jar of water, and he ate and he drank and he lay down again. And we're told that the angel came back to him and touched him and said, "Get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you." So he got up and ate and drank, strengthened by that food. He then travelled on. We all need to rest and stop and be strengthened for the next stage of the journey. It reminds us of Paul after his conversion on the road to Damascus. Once he got to Damascus, he actually had to stop, and he did nothing for some time there. And Jesus too. We're told that after he heard that John the Baptist had been beheaded, we're told that Jesus heard what had happened, and he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. He went to be in his own after everything that had taken place. And we know that Jesus was on his own from time to time. And when the disciples were busy, they had come back to Jesus at one point. We read about this in Mark chapter 6. Then, because so many people were coming and going that they did not even have a chance to eat, he said to them, "Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest." We all need to rest. God has created us to rest. God rested from his work of creation, and he built rest into the fabric of creation. The earth needs to rest. The soil and the ground needs to rest. We need to rest as well. It's what we're made to be for, regular, proper rest, where we recenter ourselves and get revitalized for the next stage of the journey. Nehemiah here rested. He'd been through a lot. He'd come through a lot, but this was just one stage, one point he'd reached. There was so much ahead of him. And for us too, we've come so far. And now there's so much ahead of us as well. Who knows what it will hold? Well, before we go any further, we need to make sure that we are well rested and that we're rested in the Lord. You need to rest. How do you rest? What does it look like in your life? It's something that we all need to think about and intentionally practice in our life. Well, after Nehemiah had rested, we know that the next thing he did was that he went and reviewed the situation. We're told, "By night I went out through the valley gate towards the jackal well and the dung gate, examining the walls of Jerusalem which had been broken down and its gates which had been destroyed by fire. Then I moved on towards the fountain gate and the king's pool, but there was not enough room for my mount to get through, so I went up the valley by night, examining the wall. Finally, I turned back and re-entered through the valley gate. The officials did not know where I had gone or what I was doing, because as yet I had said nothing to the Jews or the priests or nobles or officials or any others who would be doing the work." He's going about on his own here, reviewing the situation. And we know that he was a man of prayer. I'm sure he must have been praying to God as he was going around looking at those walls, speaking with God about the situation. It was Nehemiah's natural inclination to pray about everything and to pray first before anything else took place. As soon as he heard the news, and we read about this in chapter 1, as soon as he heard the news about Jerusalem, We're told that he mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. And then he prays, O Lord God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps his covenant of love with those who love him and obey his commands. And as he prayed, he would have been very mindful of the spiritual situation that they were in. In fact, in that prayer in chapter 1, he really makes a prayer of confession and repentance about how they've lost their way and how they need to find their way again. And we know that before Nehemiah spoke to the king about what was on his heart and what was needed, when the king said to me, "What is it you want?" we're told, "Then I prayed to the God of heaven. And then I answered the king." He was a man of prayer, and I'm sure as he was going about these walls, he would have been praying to God about the situation. And it's a good lesson for us all. In fact, Nehemiah's prayers are very instructive for us all. It's worth looking at his prayers and seeing what we can learn from them right the way throughout his book. He would also have been feeling a great compassion for the people. Again, we're told as soon as he'd heard the news at first, he broke down with compassion for them all. He sat down and he wept, and he would have been thinking compassionately about the situation that they were in. And history has been full of situations where men and women of God have had a real burden, a compassionate burden on their heart for others, and have then gone on to do something about it. We think of those tackling the slave trade, or those conditions in factories that had to be tackled as well, homelessness, injustice, the civil rights movement. And often God puts a burden of compassion on our heart that means we have to reach out to others, even if it's our own immediate family or those we know or our neighbours. That burden comes from God. I remember reading once of Salvation Army workers who were in a particularly hard mission field, and they felt they'd gone so far, but the work hadn't really gone as far as they'd wanted, and they wrote back to the equivalent of head office explaining their situation. And William Booth wrote back a very short note to them that simply said, "Try tears, try tears." Nehemiah, we know, wept for the people who were in this situation. He was a compassionate man amongst everything else. But also, as he was looking everything to, he must have been surely aware of his own weakness and his need to rely on God. We're told that as soon as he heard the news, he sat down and wept. He broke down. He really needed God's strength for this next stage. And we're told that when the king asked him what he needed, we're told he was very much afraid. He knew what it was to be fearful about things lying up ahead, and he would have seen the enormity of this task. He needed to rely on God. We're told in Philippians chapter 4 and verse 13, Paul wrote, "I can do everything through him who gives me strength." God gives us strength, but we can do everything through him. We really need to rely on God. And in fact, later on in Nehemiah, in chapter 8, we read very importantly of something that Nehemiah had discovered for his own life. In Nehemiah 8 and 10, he says this, "The joy of the Lord is your strength." He needed to draw on the strength of the Lord for the next stage. We all do. There's so much up ahead for all of us. We need to rest, yes, but even more so, we need to rely on the Lord for wisdom and guidance and for help and for strength. May you rely on the Lord for everything you require in your life, for he is with you. So Nehemiah had rested, and he was continuing to rely on God for strength and wisdom and guidance for the next stage of everything that was going to happen. And then Nehemiah begins to re-envision the people for the work of building the walls again. And he speaks to them And it's about a vision that God has laid on his heart. It's not just his own great idea. It's not just a clever plan that he's come up with. Before he says, I had not told anyone what my God had put in my heart to do for Jerusalem. This was something that came from God himself. And the people needed to hear this vision. Vision is so important. It's way beyond just what is going to be done or who's going to do it or when or how or anything like that. It's the big why question. Why are we here? Why is God calling us to do this? Why are we doing what we do? Is it for God's glory? And so Nehemiah begins to speak to the people on that level, because so often the people of God had lost their way. They started out well, they had great vision, great intentions, but then whether it was due to rebellion, disobedience, apathy, distraction, whatever it was, so often there's this infuriating downward spiral away from what God was wanting to do for them and where they were meant to be with God. And Nehemiah laying out this vision for them is pointing out the chasm, the divide between where they were, which wasn't great, and where God wanted them to be, which was great. And vision was going to get them to cross that divide, if you like. And so Nehemiah speaks to them about the vision that God has given him. And he says to them, you see the trouble we are in? Jerusalem lies in ruins and its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace. I also told them about the gracious hand of my God upon me and what the king had said to me. I love the way he identifies with them, his identification here. He doesn't say, you, look at the state you're in, look what you've done or not done. He says, you see the trouble we are in? Nehemiah's with them. He's part of them, he's part of this people. He's in the situation now as well. He's identifying with them. And there's also this invitation here. Come, let us do this. He says, let's do this together. Let's work together to see this vision of God being fulfilled among us. And there's a call to action as well. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace. And the people reply, let us start rebuilding. So they began this good work. They got a hold of the vision. They got a hold of the invitation and the action that was needed, and they all started together. You know, vision is so important. We each need a personal vision, I suppose, of who we are and why we're here, but together as a church community, we need that as well. And sometimes church activities or things just perpetuate themselves and they go on, and after a while they weren't as effective as they were, or no one really knows why we're still doing it that way, and no one's able to change things. But I suppose this lockdown period, at the very least, has helped us to review what we do. Things have stopped, whether we've liked it or not. And we get to ask the question, I wonder why we did that, or I wonder why we were being called to do that. I wonder what God is calling us to do in the future, who He's calling us to be. It's a great time to reassess vision and to think of who we want to be and how we're going to give glory to God for the next stage of the journey. And I suppose you get to think of that too. Who is God calling you to be? What is He calling you to do? You've been able to discover what your faith is really like and what your place is with God. And maybe He's been speaking to your heart as well. Well, as the people begin to rebuild, all kinds of folks get involved. They've got all kinds of different backgrounds, all different gifts and talents. They've each got a different part to play. So everybody does have a part to play. You too, in the work of rebuilding and restoration and restoring things. But we'll think about that, God willing, next time. For now, may God bless you with the vision He's laying on your heart and as He speaks into your life. Well, thanks so much for being with us again today. May you know real rest in the Lord. May you continue to rely on Him, and may the joy of the Lord be your strength for the next stage of the journey. And may you know who God is calling you to be in your heart as He draws you nearer to Himself to bless Him and those around you. Well, God bless you, and see you next time.